Hi, in a previous video, and on this very channel, I looked at the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal's first set-piece scrap with the Romans. Next up was the Battle of Lake Trasimene. As with any event in history, it is important to understand why this happened. So let's have a quick recap. It was late June in 217 BC. Around 6 months earlier, Hannibal had won at the Battle of Trebia. He now needed to take that momentum and use it decisively. To help us picture his movements a bit better, it's worth commenting on all of my artistic skills. First up, a map of Italy. After Trebia, Hannibal had moved south and was now settled in the area of modern-day Bologna. Needless to say, Rome would be hastily arranging its defence, and two new armies under Flaminius and Servilius were enlisted. Servilius went to Ariminum, modern-day Rimini, and Flaminius was sent to Arretium, modern-day Arezzo. His job was to guard the pass over the Apennine Mountains, which run down the middle of Italy. The Romans thought they'd shut the door on any route south for Hannibal. Guarding passes might obstruct a normal army, but Hannibal would cross the Alps to get here. Hannibal had managed to cross the Apennines where, as ever, he was least expected. It wasn't an easy journey. The real issue was the marshland once he had crossed the Apennines. Livy tells us of horrible conditions where men had no dry cover and no sleep for days. Apparently, it was around this point that Hannibal suffered the loss of an eye due to infection from travelling through that area. However, by taking this route, he'd avoided being trapped between the two Roman forces. He'd also taken Flaminius by surprise. Stopping nearby to the Roman camp, he raided the area, right under the nose of the general. By doing this, Hannibal hoped to lure the Romans out. It also had the effect of further weakening the image of Rome in the eyes of her allies and surrounding tribes. Hannibal understood the importance of propaganda. Hannibal now made quite a daring move. He simply marched past Flaminius' camp at Arretium. A somewhat risky idea, given that he exposed his flank, and armies on the move were always more of a vulnerable position they'd normally be in. But now, the risk was worth it. He was south of the Romans, and more importantly, between Arretium and Rome. Flaminius, even though he hadn't been baited until now, would simply have to come out. He'd have to find and confront Hannibal, which is exactly what Hannibal wanted. We'll never know if it was through luck or via his networks of scouts and spies. I favour the latter, but Hannibal knew where to lead Flaminius. Continuing south, he set up camp near Lake Trasimene and waited. As ever, no expense spent. This is the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, with Hannibal's camp in the west and Flaminius's in the east. The exact dates are debated, but one late June morning, around the 21st, the Romans broke camp and marched to face Hannibal. Or at least that's what they thought they were doing. Most, in fact, had just eaten what was to be their last breakfast. At Trebia, Hannibal had hidden some cavalry overnight, which he used to ambush the Romans. This time he turned it up a notch. Hannibal had marched most of his men out and positioned them on the hills. These were the Celts, the shock infantry. Back at camp, he had his veteran spearmen and Spanish forces hold a defensive position against the Roman attack. It would be their job simply to contain the Romans. This wasn't some disordered charge. He wanted the Roman column strung out as far as it could be and at its most vulnerable before he pounced. The ambush aimed to chop the Roman line into 3 sections. The front part was initially held up by Hannibal's veterans as planned, though a number did get through. Something similar had happened at Trebia, where some Roman units in the centre broke through and simply carried on marching. Likewise, the units in this case carried on. As they looked back on what was going on, they must have realised that the day was lost. Unlike Trebia, this escaping force didn't get away, as after the battle they were rounded up by Hannibal's cavalry. The middle and rear sections faced a dire situation. The Celts hurled themselves into the Romans, who'd had simply no time to form up. Remember, the Roman style of fighting was built around a unit in ordered formation. Contrastingly, the Celts loved broken, open space fighting and were excellent at it. To lessen their chances further, this was a Roman force with little experience or training. The forces attacking them had come out of the fog and down the hill. They'd had no way of preparing themselves for this. In short, it was butchery. You could either die amongst the confused screams of a unit or drown trying to escape, the agony of choice. The rear section also had the cavalry to contend with, who herded them back into the slaughter or drove them into the lake. Their commander, Flaminius, didn't escape and died fighting where he stood. In some sense, you can feel sorry for him. He hadn't easily been baited out. Perhaps his only mistake was thinking Hannibal wouldn't go over the Apennines, and perhaps this would be a fair gaze 99% of the time, except Hannibal had crossed the Alps. So this is something of an oversight by Flaminius and the Romans in general. The aftermath was, well, huge. 15,000 Romans dead and the rest captured. In a 3-hour battle, that's 83 dead Romans a minute, just under a Roman and a half a second. That's messy. Panic gripped Rome. They were now 0-2 versus Hannibal and had suffered huge losses. If we take the rough estimates given over the two encounters, Rome was down at least 45,000 men of fighting age. Hannibal's losses were far lower, around 1,500 men at Trasimene, meaning his total losses in Trebia and Trasimene were around 8,000. Of the losses on Hannibal's side, many were the Celts. Hannibal had managed to keep his prized veterans away from the main action, so in a sense these were really minimal in terms of reducing his effective fighting force. The damage done to Rome wasn't just felt in terms of numbers. Hannibal had cemented himself as a highly able general, so if you were a fervently anti-Roman tribe, you'd be more inclined to throw your lot in with him. But even if you were a mercenary with no specific axe to grind, here was a man leading a successful army. It would be very tempting to sign up. Psychologically, he devalued Rome in the sight of her allies, and by using the topography as he had, embarrassed Rome further. Here was a general who knew Rome's backyard better than she did. That somewhat bedraggled force, which had descended from the Alps in October, had both its coffers and its ranks in a far healthier position than Hannibal could have dreamt of. Rome's response was to appoint a dictator, a position only used in extreme situations. The chap given this role, Fabius Maximus, realised that a pitched battles with Hannibal wasn't a good idea and instead used his army to tail Hannibal, but not to engage him directly. This was a successful plan. Fabius understood that Hannibal needed victories to keep his men quiet. In a way, Fabius looked to slowly degrade the Carthaginian force. Sadly, the Roman populace didn't agree. They thought it cowardly and actually gave him the nickname Delayer. Once his term was up, they didn't reappoint him and went back to using 2 consuls. One such consul was called Varro. He was brash and was itching to get at Hannibal. Eventually he did, at a place called Cannae, and I'll pick this up in a future vlog. Thanks for watching.